Lyra opened her blue eyes to a sea of sand. The wind whispered across the dunes and stung her face. She tried to stand, but pain shot through her left leg. She sank back into the warm sand and looked at the sky. Two suns hid behind pale clouds, but their light still burned. She could not remember how long she had been alone. Last she had known, her scout ship had carried her across the quiet stars. She had been on a mission to chart the desert world of Iridia. The ship had glided over dunes that stretched to the horizon. But a sudden storm had whipped up sand and wind so fierce it tore the ship apart. Lyra had felt the impact and then cold darkness. When she woke, she found herself under twisted metal and grit. She pulled herself free and found her leg hurt badly. She wrapped her cloak around the wound and tried to send a signal. The communicator had cracked in her hand. It showed only static. She held it close to her ear, hoping for a reply from her home planet. But she heard nothing. Now she crawled through the dunes. Each movement was agony. She used her good arm to pull herself forward. She brushed sand from her face and blinked away tears. She did not know which way to go. The compass had broken. She had no map. She only had her hope. As she moved, she thought of home. She remembered the green forests of Chalara and the soft music of the rivers. She remembered her family, their gentle voices, and the bright leaves that changed color in autumn. Her people had never known war. They lived in peace and art, but now she was alone on this harsh world. The sun climbed higher and the heat deepened. Lyra draped her cloak over her head. She sipped the last drops of water from her canteen. She paused to rest under the shadow of a rock. She pressed her palm to her leg and felt her blood cool on her skin. She closed her eyes and tried not to cry. In her mind, she painted a different world. She imagined her ship safe at home, her family greeting her with smiles. She whispered to them, though she knew they could not hear. She touched the smooth stone ground and promised herself she would survive. When the sky turned orange, she rose and pushed onward. The wind died as night fell. The air grew cold and sharp. She wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and huddled against a dune. Above her, two moons glowed like pale lanterns. The desert creatures called to each other in low voices. She shivered and tried to sleep, but every gust of wind woke her. She watched the stars wheel above her. She thought of the cold nights on Chalara where she had slept under a dome of glass. There she had felt safe. Here she felt small and alone. At dawn, she woke to a red sky. Her water supply was gone. Her cloak was damp with dew. Her leg pounded with pain. She forced herself to crawl to the ridge of a nearby dune. She looked down and saw nothing but empty sand. She felt her last spark of hope fade. She decided to try one last time. She stood slowly and tested her weight on her leg. She nearly fell, but caught herself. She took one step and felt a stab of pain. She took another and another until she reached the dune crest. She fell to her knees and gasped for breath. There, in the distance, she saw movement. At first, she thought it was a trick of light. Then she saw a small black shape gliding over the sand. It moved smoothly and left no track behind it. She blinked and saw it again. It was a hover vehicle of some kind. She did not know what it meant, but she felt her heart race. She raised her arm and waved her cloak. She called out in her soft voice, but the wind carried her whisper away. She hopped forward, using her arms for support. Her legs screamed, but she did not stop. The craft drew nearer. Suddenly, the vehicle stopped near her. A hatch opened and a man climbed down. He wore light armor and held a small water flask. His face was kind and open. He approached her slowly and raised his hands in peace. Lyra gasped and sank to her hands and knees. She looked up at him with wide eyes. She did not speak his language, but she sensed he meant to help. He set down the water flask and knelt beside her. He spoke softly and tapped the flask, then held it out. She nodded and drank. The cool water soothed her throat. She closed her eyes and let him pour it slowly. When she finished, she looked at him gratefully. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she did not speak. He studied her leg and took out a small kit from his belt. He cleaned the wound and wrapped it with cloth. He worked carefully and did not hurry. She watched him with wonder. She had never seen a human before. When he was done, he offered a hand. Lyra took it and he helped her stand. She leaned on him and felt strength. He smiled and pointed to his craft. She understood. He wanted her to come with him. She took a trembling step toward the vehicle. The man waited patiently. She climbed inside and lay on the soft seat. He lifted the hatch and returned to the controls. The engines hummed and the craft rose above the sand. Lyra pressed her hand to the window and watched the dunes fall away. The man looked at her and nodded. She managed a small smile. She thought of home and wonder filled her heart. She did not know where he would take her, but she knew she was no longer alone. She closed her eyes and let the hum of the engine and the warm light carry her away from the desert she had called her prison. Lyra woke to soft lights and gentle humming. She blinked and saw a white room around her. The walls glowed faintly, and a bed held her body. She moved her hand to her leg and felt a bandage. The pain was less now. She tried to sit, but the bed helped her. She looked around and saw machines with friendly shapes. She did not know their purpose, but she felt safe. The door slid open and the man who saved her entered. His name tag read Ethan. He wore a clean uniform and smiled when he saw her awake. He spoke softly in his language. Lyra did not understand, but his tone made her calm. He held out a small mirror. She looked and saw her pale skin and long hair. Her eyes were bright and her face was streaked with sand. She touched her hair and saw loose strands fall. She realized how long it had been since she cleaned herself. Ethan left the room and returned with a bowl of clear liquid and a soft cloth. He pointed to the cloth and to Lyra's hair. She nodded. She dipped the cloth in the liquid and ran it through her hair. The water was cool and clean. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the feeling. Ethan quietly cleaned the rest of her, using gentle motions. When he was done, he offered her a simple tunic. It was soft and fitted. She took it and slipped her arms through. She felt warm and comfortable. Ethan nodded and left. Lyra took a deep breath. She touched the tunic's fabric and felt gratitude for the stranger's kindness. She rolled off the bed and stood carefully. Her legs still hurt, but she could walk a little. She held the bed's railing and took a step. She moved slowly down the hall. The floor was smooth and cooled her feet. She passed rooms with other humans. Some watched her with curiosity, but they smiled and returned to their tasks. At the end of the hall, she found a room with a large window. Outside, she saw a human city. Towers reached toward the sky. Lights glowed along roads. Hovering vehicles moved like glowing insects. She gasped at the sight. This world was a far cry from her desert home. Ethan appeared and tapped her shoulder. He pointed to the city and then to her. She understood he wanted to show her more. She nodded and followed him. They left the building and walked along a wide path. The air smelled of plants and water. She saw gardens with tall trees and bright flowers. She smelled sweet blossoms and fresh grass. She cupped the flower in her hand and smiled. Ethan smiled too and pointed to the sky. Above them, a large ship hovered. Its surface was sleek and bright. It pulsed with light. She looked up. Eyes wide, she felt fear mixed with hope. Ethan placed his hand on her shoulder and guided her forward. They arrived at a tall structure. A door stood open. They entered and climbed a ramp. Inside, Lyra saw humans working at glowing consoles. They spoke quickly into small devices. Above them, a hologram showed her desert planet. DOTs and lines circled its shape. She realized they were studying her home. A woman with short hair and calm eyes greeted Lyra. She spoke softly and held out her hand. Lyra hesitated but took it. The woman pointed to her and then to the hologram. Lyra nodded. The woman then pointed to Ethan and nodded. Ethan smiled proudly. The woman sat and beckoned Lyra to do the same. She held a device near Lyra's temple. It flashed and hummed. Lyra closed her eyes. Images filled her mind. She saw her forest home, her family's faces, and her desert ship. She saw the ship's sensors fail and the storm rise. She saw herself crawling through sand. When the device turned off, she sat in silence. The woman touched a screen and the room lit with data. She spoke and pressed a symbol on the hologram. The desert planet glowed red. Lines pointed to Lyra's crash site. The woman then pointed to a distant system. She tapped and another planet glowed blue. She turned to Lyra and spoke softly. Lyra did not understand the words, but she felt the meaning. The woman wanted to send her home. She wanted to help her people. Lyra's heart swelled. She reached out and touched the woman's hand. The woman squeezed her fingers and smiled. Ethan guided Lyra back outside. They walked in silence. Lyra held her tunic and thought of her family. She felt hope she had not felt since the crash. They reached a grassy hill overlooking the city. Ethan offered Lyra a small fruit. She bit into it. The taste was sweet and juicy. She closed her eyes and savored it. Ethan laughed softly and ate one too. After a moment, Ethan pointed toward the horizon. Lyra saw the desert planet's twin moons. In the sky, she gasped. They hung low and pale. She looked at Ethan and realized time had passed. He must have brought her far. She sat on the grass and watched the moons. She thought of home. She thought of her family waiting for her signal. She thought of the journey she would soon make. The sun began to set. The sky turned orange. Lights flickered on in the city below. Ethan sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Lyra leaned into him. She felt safe. She whispered a word in her language. Ethan turned to her. She spoke slowly and pointed to herself, then to Ethan. She said his name, and he nodded. She pointed to the moons and spoke her word for home. Ethan smiled and nodded. She repeated it. She pointed to the city and said the word for here. Ethan repeated that word too. They sat in silence as the night grew. Lyra felt gratitude for this human. He had saved her life and showed her kindness. She felt a bond stronger than words. At last, Ethan stood and held out his hand. Lyra took it. He led her down the hill toward a small craft. Its door glowed and opened. He helped her inside. She sat and braced herself. The engines hummed and the craft lifted. It joined others flying over the city. Lyra watched the lights and felt wonder. She knew soon she would fly across the stars to her home. Inside the craft, Ethan handed her a small box. She opened it and saw a device shaped like a star. He tapped it and it glowed. He pointed to it and then to Lyra's heart. She understood. It was a gift. She placed it over her chest and felt warmth. Then the craft rose higher. The city lights shrank below. Lyra watched the horizon and felt her heart beat fast. She touched the device and saw images of her homeworld appear inside it. She saw forests, rivers, and her family waiting. Tears fell down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. She turned to Ethan. She nodded and spoke her word for thank you. He smiled and touched his chest. He spoke his word for friend. Lyra smiled. As the craft flew into space, Lyra closed her eyes. She held the star device tight. She dreamed of home and of the journey. Ahead, she knew she was not alone. She had a friend and a path back to her world. The craft glided through space. Lyra pressed her hand against the star device and watched stars pass by. Ethan sat beside her and kept his eyes on the controls. He guided the ship along a safe path. Lyra felt the gentle hum of the engines and leaned back. The cabin lights dimmed. Lyra closed her eyes and rested. She remembered Iridia and its red deserts. She thought of Shalara and its green forests. She yearned for home. Ethan noticed her silence and offered a small snack. Lyra took a bite and smiled. The taste was simple but good. A warning beep broke the quiet. Ethan looked at a screen. A cluster of debris floated ahead. He tapped controls and the craft changed course. Lyra sat up and watched the debris field. She felt a flicker of fear. She thought of another crash. Ethan turned and spoke kindly. Lyra did not know his words, but she sensed his calm. He took her hand and guided it to the seat belt. She nodded and fastened it. The craft shook as it moved through the debris. Lyra gripped the armrest. A small rock tapped the hull and Lyra felt a jolt. She gasped, but Ethan stayed steady. He steered the craft around larger chunks. Dust drifted past the window. After a minute, the debris cleared. The craft smoothed and the stars returned. Lyra unbuckled and touched Ethan's arm. He nodded and offered water. She drank slowly. Then she looked at him and smiled. Ethan smiled back and tapped the star device. It glowed softly. The ship's intercom clicked. A voice spoke in a firm tone. Ethan replied and tapped a button. He spoke into a mic. Lyra heard a distant voice. She did not understand, but she felt the message was urgent. A map appeared on the screen, a point marked halfway to Iridia. Another marker blinked near a dark region. The voice on the intercom spoke again. Ethan frowned and tapped the screen. He pressed another button. Lyra noticed Ethan's concern. She placed her hand on his arm. He looked at her and nodded. He tapped the screen again. He spoke softly. Lyra watched the map. A new route appeared. It curved around the dark region. Ethan nudged the controls. The ship turned and followed the new path. Lyra watched the stars shift outside. A day passed. Lyra and Ethan kept to routine. They ate, they rested, and they watched the view. Lyra learned some words. Ethan said them slowly. She repeated. She pointed to the ship and said its name. Ethan laughed softly and said another word. On the second day, Lyra felt strong enough to stand. Ethan helped her to her feet. She walked a few steps and leaned on the wall. Ethan pointed to a small exercise area. Lyra stepped inside. She did simple stretches. Her legs still hurt, but it was better. She moved slowly. Ethan watched and nodded. She touched her leg and thanked him. After exercise, Ethan showed Lyra a small desk. He handed her a pad and a pen. She had never written with pen before. She made simple shapes and symbols. Ethan pointed to each shape and spoke. Lyra listened and wrote down the words. She practiced each day. She wrote her name and Ethan's name. She wrote words for ship, star, and friend. The device glowed when she pointed. At a symbol, she learned quickly. One morning, alarms rang. Lyra jumped and ran to Ethan. The screen showed a large ship in front of them. It blocked their path. The ship was dark and angular. Ethan spoke urgently. Lyra felt worry. The dark ship sent beams of light toward them. Ethan tapped controls. The craft shook. Lyra held his arm. A voice echoed from the dark ship. It spoke in a harsh tone. Ethan replied into the mic. The voice shouted back. Lyra did not understand, but she heard anger. Suddenly, the dark ship fired a beam. It struck their hull and the craft rocked. Lights flickered. Lyra fell to the floor. Ethan rushed to the controls. He tapped buttons and the ship rose. Lyra crawled to the window. She saw the dark ship following them. She gasped. Ethan's face was tense. He spoke into the mic again. Another beam hit. The craft shuddered and alarms blared. Lyra covered her ears. Ethan fought to steady the ship. He adjusted the course and the craft sped away. The dark ship chased them. Lyra watched the stars blur. Ethan tapped controls. The ship jumped, a bright flash, and they disappeared. The cabin was still. Lyra and Ethan looked at each other. Ethan checked the screens. He sighed with relief. The dark ship was gone. Lyra stood and hugged Ethan. He smiled weakly and patted her back. She felt his heartbeat and it calmed her. Ethan spoke softly and pointed to the map. They had left the dark region. They were safe again. Lyra nodded and sat beside him. Over the next hours, they repaired the hull. Ethan worked on panels while Lyra handed tools. She imitated his motions and learned quickly. They worked in silence but shared understanding. When repairs finished, they sat and ate. Lyra offered Ethan a piece of fruit. He accepted and smiled. The craft resumed course. Lyra and Ethan sat together. Lyra placed the star device in her lap. It glowed brightly. She smiled at Ethan and pressed the device. It showed the forests of Celara. She touched the image and closed her eyes. She whispered words of hope. Ethan watched and nodded. Night fell in the cabin. Lyra lay on her bed. Ethan checked the controls. He turned off lights and sat across from her. He watched her rest. Lyra felt safe. She dreamed of Shalara and Iridia. She dreamed of her family. She dreamed of the rescue ship coming. The next day, the craft approached a bright ship. It was triangular and hovered quietly. Antennas glowed. Lyra saw her people's symbols on its hull. She ran to Ethan and pointed ahead. He looked and smiled. Lyra burst into tears of joy. Ethan held her and smiled. The rescue ship signaled. Ethan replied and guided their craft close. A hatch opened on the big ship. A group of aliens in green uniforms greeted Lyra. They rushed forward and embraced her. Lyra wept and smiled. Ethan stepped back respectfully. The green uniformed aliens looked at him with curiosity. Lyra introduced Ethan. He bowed slightly and offered his hand. They shook hands. The head alien, a tall woman with wise eyes, spoke to Lyra. Lyra nodded and hugged her leader. They led Lyra onto their ship. Ethan waved goodbye. Lyra turned and waved back. As she left, she looked at Ethan one last time. She mouthed the word for friend. Ethan mouthed back. The hatch closed in Lyra's rescue ship rose. Ethan watched until it was a bright speck. Alone in his craft, Ethan set a new course. He thought of Lyra in the forest world. He tapped his cum. He would tell others of kindness and hope. Lyra S rescue ship glowed as it flew. Home, she held the star device and felt warmth. She knew she would never forget the human who saved her. She closed her eyes and smiled. Lyra's rescue ship glided toward her homeworld. She pressed her hand to the star device and watched the blue and green planet grow larger. Memories filled her mind, the crash, the desert, and the human's kindness. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She felt her heart pound with hope. When the ship landed on a smooth pad, a group of Celeran officers and healers ran to greet her. They wore bright robes and carried soft mats. The lead officer, a tall woman named Celia, knelt beside Lyra. She spoke gently in Celeran and held Lyra's hand. Lyra felt the foreign words wash over her like a warm breeze. Lyra stood slowly with Celia's help. Her legs still ached, but she could walk. She stepped onto the mat and felt the soft fibers under her feet. Around her, her family emerged from the crowd. Her mother, father, and brother ran forward. Tears filled their eyes as they hugged her. Lyra wept with joy. Her mother held her face and spoke in a low voice. Lyra nodded and touched her mother's cheek. Her father patted her back and whispered words of relief. Her brother pressed a small flower into her hand. Lyra smiled and placed the flower in her hair. Celia guided Lyra to a reception tent. Inside, healers worked at glowing tables. They used gentle instruments to scan Lyra's leg and her mind. The healers cleaned the wound and applied new bandages. Lyra sat quietly and watched each careful motion. A healer placed a small sphere on Lyra's chest. It glowed as it healed her star device wound. She felt warmth spread through her body. The healer spoke to Celia and Celia nodded. Lyra felt strength return. When healing finished, Celia led Lyra to a large garden. Tall trees arched overhead and flowers bloomed in soft colors. Birds sang in the branches. Lyra inhaled deeply. She had missed this scent. Her mother released her hand and Lyra took her brother's hand instead. They walked slowly among the flowers. Her brother pointed to a fountain in the center and spoke excitedly. Lyra laughed and nodded. They reached the fountain. Clear water danced from its center. Lyra knelt and cupped water in her hands. She drank and felt the cool liquid fill her bones. She smiled and offered water to her brother. He drank with a grin. Celia approached Lyra and presented a small crystal box. Inside was the star device. She handed it to Lyra. Lyra opened the box and held the glowing device. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface. Celia spoke and pointed to the horizon. Lyra followed her gaze. She saw a group of ships in the sky. They glowed softly and moved like birds. She recognized the shapes. They were the human crafts. Lyra S heart leaped. She turned to Celia. Celia nodded. Lyra looked down and whispered a Celeran word for gratitude. Celia smiled and returned the word. Suddenly, the sky filled with human ships. They descended and landed near the garden. Ethan's craft was among them. Lyra gasped and ran forward. Her family and Celia followed. Ethan emerged from his ship. He waved. Lyra broke into a run and leapt into his arms. Ethan caught her. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held him tight. Tears streamed down her face. Ethan smiled and held Lyra. He set her down gently. She stepped back and looked at him. He bowed slightly. She bowed too, remembering politeness when meeting. Celeran leaders. Celia approached Ethan. She spoke in Celeran. Lyra translated softly. Celia said, "Thank you for saving our Lyra." Ethan nodded and spoke his word for friend. Lyra took Ethan's hand and guided him to her family. She introduced him to her mother and father. He bowed politely. Her father offered a fruit from the garden. Ethan accepted and took a bite. He nodded in approval. Her brother handed Ethan a small plant sapling wrapped in cloth. Lyra translated, "The gift, a symbol of life and friendship." Ethan's eyes brightened. He accepted the gift and pressed the sapling to his chest. A Celeran musician began to play a soft melody on a stringed instrument. The music filled the air like a gentle breeze. Lyra smiled and took Ethan's hand. She led him to dance among the flowers. They danced slowly. Lyra's leg was steady under her now. The music wove around them. Ethan's free hand held the air as if catching notes. Lyra laughed when he missed a step. He laughed too. As the sun lowered, lanterns lit along the garden paths. The sky turned gold and pink. Lyra felt peace fill her chest. She looked at Ethan. He looked back and smiled. After the dance, Lyra's parents guided Ethan to a table. They sat and ate sweet fruits and soft breads. Lyra and Ethan shared stories. She pointed to her star device and spoke of the human desert. She mimed crawling in the sand. Ethan nodded and mimed the storm. Her family listened with wide eyes. Her mother asked Lyra about Ethan. Lyra smiled and said he was kind. Ethan spoke. Simple words: help, friend, home. Lyra translated. After the meal, Celia stood and tapped a crystal. The music shifted to a grander tune. She spoke to the crowd. Lyra did not understand, but she felt celebration in the air. Celerans came forward with gifts. A painter gifted a portrait of Lyra and Ethan. A sculptor offered a small statue of their two forms. Lyra accepted each gift with grace. Ethan looked surprised by so much honor. Lyra squeezed his hand. When the celebration ended, Lyra walked with Ethan under lantern-light paths. She showed him the gardens and the fountains. She spoke of her world's beauty. Ethan listened and nodded. They reached a quiet pool of water. Lyra looked at her reflection and then at Ethan's reflection beside hers. She felt joy ripple through her. She spoke softly, and Ethan repeated her words. They meant friend and promise. Lyra placed her hand on the water's surface. Ripples spread. Ethan knelt and touched the water too. Together, they whispered their promise, that they would remember each other and share peace between their worlds. Lyra leaned against Ethan. The night breeze carried the scent of flowers. She closed her eyes and felt safe. At last, Ethan stood. He held out a small communicator. He tapped it, and a beam of light shone into the sky. Lyra smiled and tapped her star device. The two lights danced. They watched until the lights faded. Lyra grasped Ethan's hand and led him to the path home. She knew the next day they would say farewell. But tonight, they would cherish their bond under the lanterns and stars. As they walked, Lyra whispered a word in Celeran. Ethan repeated it. It meant home. Lyra stood at the window of the rescue ship. Solara's oceans and mountains stretched below. She felt joy and relief. Her family and friends waited for her return. She pressed the star device. It glowed bright and warm. Ethan's message arrived. On her personal communicator, he wrote, "Safe journey, friend." Lyra typed back the word for gratitude in Celeran. She hoped he would understand. When the ship docked in Solara's main port, dignitaries and citizens gathered. Banners flew, showing Lyra's symbol and the human symbol side by side. Crowds cheered as she walked down the ramp. She wore a simple robe and the star device hung at her chest. Her family rushed forward. Her mother hugged her tightly. Her father's eyes shone. Her brother waved a flag. Lyra smiled and waved back. She felt her heart expand with love. Celia and the alien leaders escorted Lyra to a grand hall. Tall pillars held up a domed roof. Sunlight entered through glass panels and lit colorful mosaics. Lyra's footsteps echoed on smooth stone. Inside, a large crowd waited. Celeran delegates and human representatives stood together. Ethan stood at the front, his uniform bright and clean. He saluted Lyra when she entered. Lyra approached the stage. She touched her star device and felt its hum. Celia spoke in Celeran. Translators repeated the words in human. Celia said, "Today we honor Lyra, who survived against all odds, and we also honor Ethan, whose kindness bridged two worlds." Crowds applauded. Lyra's eyes met Ethan's. She bowed to him and then to the crowd. She spoke into a mic. "Thank you, my people, my friend. Today we stand together." She spoke slowly in simple celestial words while translators repeated. Ethan stepped forward. He spoke in human. "Lyra taught me courage. Her spirit showed us hope. Thank you, Lyra, and thank you, Shalara, for welcoming me." The crowd cheered. Flowers rained from above. Petals fell like gentle rain. Lyra laughed and wiped her eyes. She turned to Ethan. He smiled back. After the ceremony, a feast filled the hall. Tables groaned under platters of fruits, breads, and sweet cakes. Humans and Celerans shared food. Lyra sat between Celia and Ethan. She tasted a honey cake. It was rich and sweet. Celia offered a spiced fruit. Lyra tried it and gasped at the flavor. Ethan laughed and offered his water flask. She drank and smiled. As they ate, Lyra pointed to Ethan's uniform and asked about his world. He spoke softly and described his desert home. He showed holograms of dunes and stars. Lyra listened with wonder. Ethan asked about Celeran art. Lyra pointed to the mosaics and explained their stories. She described the autumn leaves and river songs. Ethan nodded and sketched a leaf on his pad. The feast continued with music. Celeran flutes and human drums filled the air. Lyra stood and danced gracefully. Ethan joined, learning the steps slowly. The crowd cheered as they moved in harmony. Later, Lyra and Ethan stepped onto a balcony overlooking the celebration. The night sky shone with stars. 2 moons hovered above the city. Lyra pointed to the moons and whispered her word for memory. She held up the star device. Ethan tapped it. It glowed softly under moonlight. She spoke her word for promise. Ethan repeated. They placed their hands on the device together. Lyra breathed in the cool night air. She thought of the desert, of the human who saved her. She thought of the journey still ahead. Ethan looked at her and spoke. Our worlds are better together. Lyra nodded. She reached into her robe and took out a small box. Inside was a seed from Celara's oldest tree. She offered it to Ethan. He accepted and held it gently. She explained. It was a symbol of life and trust. Ethan looked at her, eyes bright. He nodded and promised to plant it on his world. The night deepened. The celebration below continued. Lyra and Ethan stood quietly, side by side. At last, Lyra said farewell. She hugged Ethan and whispered, "Until next time," he replied. "Always, friend." They released their embrace. Lyra returned to her family and clan tent. She placed the seed and star device on a carved table. She knelt and placed her forehead on her hands. She prayed in silence. The next morning, Lyra stood before her council. She spoke of friendship, courage, and unity. Celeran and human diplomats listened and agreed to new missions of peace. The council approved a joint fleet to explore new worlds together. Lyra and Ethan would lead the mission. After the meeting, Lyra found Ethan at the docks. Ships prepared for departure. Crew members loaded supplies. Flags of both worlds flew en masse. Lyra and Ethan shook hands and said, "To new horizons." The fleet's engines HUMED. Their ships lifted into the sky. Lyra stood on deck and watched Shalara fall below. Ethan's ship flew beside hers. They smiled and pressed the star device. It glowed a steady light, guiding them forward. As they flew into the stars, Lyra and Ethan felt hope for both worlds and for the universe they would explore together. The joint fleet left Celara's orbit and entered space. Lyra stood on the bridge of her ship. Ethan stood on his own ship's bridge. They watched the stars ahead. Lyra felt excitement and calm. She touched the star device at her chest. It glowed softly. Days passed as the two ships traveled. Crews from both worlds worked together. Humans and Celerans shared meals, stories, and laughter. Lyra and Ethan met each morning to plan their course. They pointed at maps and spoke in simple words. 1. Evening, a bright object appeared on the horizon. Lyra tapped the comb and spoke to Ethan. He replied and sent the view. The object was a small green planet with rings. Curious, they guided their ships closer. Lyra felt her heart race. She had never seen rings so close. Ethan smiled and adjusted the controls. The fleet entered orbit. The planet's surface showed oceans and islands. Colorful lights dotted the land. Lyra pointed to a landmass and said, "Explore." Ethan nodded. A small landing shuttle left Ethan's ship. Lyra joined and sat beside him. They wore light suits and helmets. The shuttle glided down through clouds. When they landed, soft grass covered the ground. Tall trees with silver leaves rose around them. Colorful birds flew overhead. Lyra knelt and touched the grass. It was soft and cool. Ethan scanned the area. He spoke his word for safe. Lyra nodded. They walked toward a forest edge. They found a village of small creatures. They had round bodies and bright eyes. They built houses in the trees. The creatures watched Lyra and Ethan with curiosity. Lyra raised her hand and waved. A creature stepped forward. It chirped and pointed to its head. It made a gentle gesture. Lyra and Ethan exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan tapped his comb and spoke his word for friend. The creature chirped and smiled. It held out a small fruit. Lyra took it and tasted it. It was crisp and sweet. The creatures guided them through the village. They pointed to a large tree in the center. Its trunk was wide and twisted. Roots reached into the sky. A creature climbed the tree and hung a glowing orb on a branch. It lit the area with soft light. The other creatures cheered and danced. Lyra and Ethan smiled. Lyra placed her hand on the tree trunk. She felt warmth. The star device glowed in response. Suddenly the ground shook. Lyra stumbled and caught herself on the tree. Ethan steadied her. They looked around as creatures ran back to their homes. A low rumble grew louder. The trees swayed. A large beast emerged from the forest. It had 4 legs and glowing eyes. Its fur was silver and white. Lyra and Ethan stood still. The beast sniffed the air. It looked at Lyra. She felt fear but held her ground. Ethan stood beside her. The beast lowered its head. It snorted and then turned away. It walked back into the forest. The creatures watched quietly. One creature returned to Lyra and placed a small flower on the tree trunk. Lyra touched the flower and smiled. Ethan clicked his recorder. Lyra spoke her word for peace. Ethan nodded and recorded. The creatures guided them back to the shuttle. Lyra collected a sample of the silver leaves. Ethan took soil samples. They worked carefully. Back on the ships, Lyra and Ethan shared their findings. Scientists studied the samples and took notes. Lyra pointed at graphs and spoke her words. Ethan translated to human. After days of study, Lyra and Ethan met in the corridor. They reflected on the planet's life. They spoke of harmony and balance. Ethan said, "Friend." Lyra nodded. They understood each other without many words. The fleet set course for home. Lyra stood at the window and watched the green planet fade. Ethan stood beside her. Days later, they reached Celara's system. Lyra saw homes, forests, and rivers. She felt joy. They docked both ships. Crews cheered. Lyra's family and Celia welcomed them. Ethan smiled at the reunion. In the grand hall, Lyra and Ethan presented their discoveries. Celeran and human leaders listened. The council approved a plan to protect the new world. Lyra and Ethan received medals of honor. Lyra's chest glowed with the star device. Ethan's chest carried the Celeran seed. After the ceremony, Lyra and Ethan walked through the gardens. They spoke of future journeys. They dreamed of sharing knowledge. As night fell, they reached the quiet pool again. Lyra touched the water and Ethan's reflection appeared. Lyra whispered friend and promised. Ethan repeated. They placed their hands on the water. Ripples formed. Lyra looked at Ethan and said, "Until next journey." Ethan nodded. Always. They walked away under lanterns and stars. The future awaited, bright and full of hope.